talk to you a little bit about the method of science. We're going to talk about the definition of science, the scientific method, some vocabulary that goes with the scientific method, and the difference between scientific law and scientific theory. So first, science. Science is the study of the world around us. It's the process that uses observation and investigation to gain knowledge about events in nature. So nature is not just the biology of plants and other things outside. It means the whole world, everything that you can see and beyond the world. So it's a process that uses observation and investigation. So we're observing what's happening, looking around, and then also investigating and doing experiments to prove things in science. In order to do these investigations, we have to use the scientific method. The scientific method is an organized set of investigation procedures used by scientists. So it's a step-by-step process that they go through. Now, keep in mind as we talk about the scientific method, it does not necessarily have to go in order step by step. Sometimes you have to backtrack and go back up a step before you can continue on. So let's talk a little bit about those steps. The first thing is asking a question or coming up with a problem. You have to have a reason for doing your experiment. Then you need to research the problem and gain as much knowledge that you can. Other scientists have already done many experiments with it. There's things that you need to know in order to conduct the experiment. That is your research behind it. Then you need to form a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is going to be a testable statement that is the end result, what you think the end result will be. And that needs to be based off of your research that you've done. It needs to be an educated guess, testable prediction. And we'll talk about the vocab here in a minute. But moving on, after you have an hypothesis, you need to design an experiment. And this experiment needs to have a control that you're comparing it to. And when you conduct experiments, you only want to measure one thing at a time. So you have to look at your variables and only change one variable. Then you need to gather and analyze the data. So create data tables, write down the data, create graphs to put that data in so that way it makes sense to you and other people as you look at it. Looking at that graph, then you come up with a conclusion. And in that conclusion, you need to summarize the data, summarize your results, give an explanation of the reasoning for those results. And after you write that conclusion, an important part of the scientific method is to share your results with others. Scientists do this every day. If they didn't share their results, what would be the reason for doing the scientific method in the experiment that they're doing? And then a lot of times you have to go back and do further research. Let's say your hypothesis was incorrect. You want to go back and do some more research about it and then conduct another experiment. This whole roundabout process is what scientists go through every day. So some vocabulary that goes with this scientific method. We have hypothesis, which I said was an educated guess or a testable prediction. It's a testable statement. You can design an experiment to test if this is correct or not. An experiment is an organized procedure for testing the hypothesis. So it's step by step, very specific, exactly what you need to do in order to see if your hypothesis is correct or incorrect. Your control, when you're designing your experiment, the control is the standard for comparison. If you were conducting an experiment trying to see if different liquids helped a plant grow better, so you tried some pop, some Gatorade, some coffee, your control would be the water. That's what you're comparing it to because that's what we always use. So you want to see if any of the other stuff would be better than the water. The constant is a factor that doesn't vary in an experiment. So it's not going to change. If you were doing the plant experiment there, you would use the same amount of liquid. You would put all of the plants in the same amount of sunlight. These are constants. They're not changing. The independent variable then in your experiment is the factor that is adjusted by the experiment. You change this variable. This is the liquid that you're changing. You change it. It's the independent variable. Independent. I change it. And then dependent variable is the factor whose value depends on the independent value. So it's going to depend on what you changed. With the plants, we changed the water or the liquid that we use. That's the independent variable. And the height that the plants grow would depend on what liquid we use. That's the dependent variable, the height it grew. So when you're analyzing this data, the independent variable goes on the x-axis of a graph, and the dependent variable goes on the y-axis of a graph. And we'll talk about graphs at a later time. And finally, we need to discuss scientific law versus scientific theory. A scientific law is a rule of nature that sums up related observations to describe a pattern in nature. This always happens. We can prove it. You can see it in nature, the law of gravity. Every time we drop something, it falls to the ground. A scientific theory then is an explanation based on experiments, and it's the most logical explanation. So we don't know 100% for sure that that's what's happening, but based on experiments that are done, it's the most logical explanation. It gives an answer to why something is occurring the way it is. So the black hole theory, the theory of evolution, okay? We don't know, we can't actually prove it, but it's a logical explanation to everything. So we talked about the method of science. We talked about the definition of science, the scientific method, some vocabulary with the scientific method, and then the scientific law versus scientific theory.